So we initiated this to talk about SIEM systems and logging and all that kind of good stuff. This is a slide I picked up off the Splunk site. I really like it because everybody always talks about Splunk, and I highlighted these pieces here. What really struck me as funny about this is what Splunk currently has on their website. It's what they show as a 2020 initiative, and it's what we've been telling you guys to do for about 5 years now. So I kind of find it amusing that these guys who are supposed to be great at SIEM and log management and all of this stuff, they're really just getting into talking about things like behavioral analytics, logs from firewalls being integrated, everything that we've been kind of holding as commonplace and things that really should be done. The big question I think people had mentioned was, why do SIEMs fail? So this is a chart that doesn't actually refer to any vendor specifically, but it's a really interesting exercise to go through of why SIEMs fail. So a lot of times people ask us, what SIEM do we like? What's our preferred vendor? And the answer is none. The answer is none because it really depends. What are you trying to do with it? What do you want it to do? I don't know if anyone's really familiar with choosing a SIEM, but I have it broken down here into 4 different columns. Most people, especially when you're dealing with the vendor sales engineer, you say, will it support this stuff? They say yes, right? But then what does it actually mean to support those things? When we look at it, they have to prove basically 4 different levels of support for any vendor. And that's why when people ask us, what's the vendor we choose, we say none, because we need to know, what do you have? Because based on what you have, maybe it's a vendor we like called AlertLogic that's the best. Maybe it's BAE that's the best. Maybe it's Event Tracker that's the best. But it really depends on what are all of the things that you have. And the biggest issue we run into for this is sales engineers always say, yes, it supports it. No problem, we can do it. The interesting things that we find here are almost everybody will say, yeah, we'll take the logs. And then at the end of the day, you get a big bucket of logs, which is really not useful. I mean, most of you guys have at some point been doing IT long enough, you've looked at raw logs. They're useless. They don't have any true context, and there's gigs and gigs and gigs and gigs of it. The next piece here is, can they do a parser on it? So anybody who is a SIEM or a SOC as a service or any of those buzzwords, they need to parse the log. That means they need to get the syslog file or whatever methodology you're using for the logs, and they need to be able to say, okay, here's what each field is. Have any of you ever programmed a syslog reader? If you haven't, that's what these SIEM vendors have to do. And what's interesting is almost every time a firewall, as an example, is upgraded, those logs change. And you have to hope your SIEM vendor is fast enough that they update their stuff in conjunction with every time the vendor updates their side of the fence. And so to sit there and think, okay, well, one SIEM vendor can do every product that was ever created, it's just fundamentally impossible, right? No one can keep up. So every vendor's better at some segment of the IT solution set out there. Next piece here is parsing it is one thing, and then the next piece is, can they review the logs? A lot of times SOC and SIEM kind of clash in terms of, is it a bucket of logs, or are there analysts reviewing the logs and trying to find something interesting for you, and where is that level set going to be? What we found is that the ability to do log review is one step past parsing. And typically this is the point where sales reps and sales engineers for the vendors, they can't answer this question anymore. And you gotta say, okay, I want an advanced person to come and answer this question, so I know when I ask you, if I push the Juniper logs, can you read them? First, if they say yes, you know they're lying. And then second is they can answer that question in a realistic manner. The third part of that is really where you get into threat hunting, and that's being able to actively have SOC analysts watch the logs and make meaningful information out of it. And so behavioral analytics means they have to be able to get all the way to the right there. Okay? If they can't get all the way to the right for every device you have, they can't really do behavioral analytics because they can't read the data. They could do forensics, because let's face it, a log archive started as a big forensics bucket, right? You wanted a big spot to store all your logs, so if something bad happened, you can go search for it and go find it. But everything we're talking about from a security aspect is getting into behavioral analytics, finding weird things. How do we get the guy who's been in the environment for a month, a year, 2 years, whatever it is? That requires behavioral analytics, which means you have to be able to do all of the fancy things with every single log you have. And this kind of goes into, Behzad, one of your questions of how do you know if a system is good? Well, if you have a SIEM and your SIEM can't read the system, then the system might be the greatest thing in the world. But if the rest of your security environment can't talk to it, well, that's kind of takes it out of the line. And it becomes more of a question of what's your goal to accomplish, and a little less of which vendor solution can really fit the bill for any given task. I like to harp on what do you want the SIEM to do. We get into a conversation a lot with SIEMs, and one of the things we always figure out kind of towards the end of scoping what someone's talking about is the final concerns that people have. And what we want to say here is that should really go first. So for example, if one of the reasons you're looking for a new SIEM is because your AWS site got hacked, that really needs to be at the beginning of any conversation about what are you trying to do, what kind of SIEM system do you want, and will that actually do something useful and functional for you? Typically we run into is that people aren't quite sure what the SIEM system should do. There's a lot of marketing about it, right? So there's a lot of buzzwords about it. I bet if we made everybody write down what is a SIEM, what is a SOC, and what is an MSSP, you'd all say something completely different about each one. Because it really depends on your point of view and who you've run into in the industry. So what we like to start with is, what does your current system miss that you wish it had? What are your top 3 objectives to get out of your SIEM? And then really, what's let you down in the past that you're trying to prevent? What is a previous state that you wish to not happen again? And that should really dictate where you're going in terms of a SIEM system. Separate from that, we like to say, well, what are the goals? Are you trying to find anomalous behaviors, bad actors, or are you trying to archive logs and forensics? I can tell you a good logging forensics system is generally not a good threat management system. Mostly because one is a data analytics meant for historics. One is a little bit more real-time and kind of a cross between data warehousing and real-time analytics. The systems just don't blend together. So you need to know what is your real goal here. And sometimes the answer is both. However, in those times, more likely the answer is going to be, okay, well, let's get you a simple archive to make some auditor happy, but then let's go do some threat management that's actually going to save your bacon and rescue you from fire when it's going to happen, as opposed to a larger system that kind of claims to do both. Typically, you end up with it doesn't do either one very well, and then no one ends up happy. The other piece is, what else are you looking for? Are you doing it for compliance or safety? And then, traditional SIEM, what we're finding is, traditional SIEM is, it's already happened, you've already generated a log, and you're trying to catch things that generated a log. Most of the attacks that we talk about in these events, they don't generate logs. They don't care about your logs. Eternal Blue is going memory to memory, chip to chip. It could care less about any kind of logging in your environment. So things like that, SIEM isn't even going to help. So if that's really what the fear is, or if the issue is you want threat management for things like that, well then traditional SIEM is less and less in line with being the answer that you're looking for. And then occasionally we'll get someone to say the goal is a single pane of glass, right? So I like to call that a unicorn hunt because it doesn't really exist. And when you think about it, they would have to perfectly understand every single piece of IT service application equipment that you've got and somehow present it. It's not going to happen. We could probably go around the room. I bet you has a different level set of Microsoft Office, Windows 10, some Windows 7 is probably floating around on at least some of you guys. And then, of course, Windows 10, you got 1607 all the way to 1908 at this point. None of these logs look the same, right? So getting a single pane of glass, not really going to happen there. And then we like to talk about SIEM scoping from the aspect of how far do you want to go? What are you really trying to get here? Something that people always think about last is things like, well, do you want your antivirus to feed the SIEM? Right? Your antivirus is at the endpoint. It's probably the first trigger you have that something obvious bad happened. And pretty much nobody ropes those into a seam. So then it comes to the question, well, what was the seam for? What was it trying to do? And I can tell you, most customers tell us we've got Trend, we've got McAfee, we've got Symantec, we've got Norton, we've got all of those kind of traditional antiviruses. Then we'll go talk to the normal seam vendors. Do you support any of these? No. We can't pull the logs off that. And then it gets weirder. Let's say you've got CrowdStrike. Let's say you've got CB Defense. What's interesting about those guys, they're cloud-driven. They work really well, very happy. They don't want to give their logs to a seam either. And so then you have the question of, okay, what am I really getting out of my seam now? Because the world has changed, right? When we controlled everything, everything was behind our four walls, seams were great because we had visibility of absolutely everything. Now that things are distributed, how effective can that seam really be? Another piece we like to pick on here is switches and routers. One of the things that we find when someone says, okay, I want to hook my switch and my router into my SIEM system, is that they're not really looking for a SIEM system. Because switches and routers don't really have good logs. Unless you're running network access control, in which case you're really pulling network access control logs, not switch and router logs. What you're really looking there is some kind of IPFix or NetFlow logging, which means you're doing network traffic analysis. And so this becomes yet another type of threat management. And what we find is if someone's not very clear on what they're getting into, a lot of SIEM vendors will claim they do it. And they'll claim they can collect that data. But collecting it and keeping a big bucket of it doesn't mean it's useful. Right? We can put all kinds of words in a big string of encyclopedias, but if there's no index, no one is going through that shelf of old school encyclopedias to try to find an answer. It's just not going to happen, right? You're going to Google it or do something useful to get the answer quickly. Another piece here that we find more and more when we're talking to folks is, well, what about Salesforce? What about your SaaS apps? What about things like Jira? What about your cloud systems? And it's very interesting. People who have a SIEM already, we start talking about those and they're like, yeah, I don't get those logs. And yeah, those logs don't correlate at all. And so more and more, especially with coronavirus happening, you're going to have people hitting your cloud apps. That was the whole point, right? To have cloud apps that people could hit from anywhere. At least that's what the business wanted to do. So at that point, the question is, what are you trying to do, or what is that you wish you had from your SIEM so that you can come up with a solution that's actually going to provide the net effect of what you're looking for? So more of why SIEMs fail. First bullets here are absolutes. Anytime we hear this, that project is absolute failure. Or we'll read someone's RFP and they come to us and say, my SIEM doesn't work, we're really unhappy with it. We'll say, well, what'd you ask for? And they use any of those words. Everything, all, always, always on. Any of those absolutes means that people didn't really understand the solution that they were trying to buy. And unfortunately, vendor always says, yeah, sure, no problem, it'll do everything. And so that's a very important piece because you end up with an unfunctional system or just a really traditional log bucket. And log buckets have a good role, right? If you have some kind of compliance that says keep every log you've ever had for 7 years because the compliance guys say so, hey, at least you've got that. And if the FBI wants to go dig through those logs, they can. But that's not really what most people want out of life nowadays, right? Most people want something that's actually going to help them and help them be secure. Another piece here is just because something makes a log doesn't mean a SIEM can make it useful. So for example, we're working with one customer who got, I'll call it hacked this time, and they had a firewall, okay? The SIEM vendors don't manage your firewall. Most SOC as a service vendors don't manage your firewall. Bill and I were going through this one vendor who had a great FAQ, and at the bottom of it is, we keep our SOC analysts from burning out because we don't make them configure your firewall. You have to do that for them. And so it's kind of interesting that even these really expensive 24/7 guys, they don't touch it because that's infrastructure. You guys are supposed to touch it. And what's interesting is just because that firewall makes logs doesn't mean the logs are useful, doesn't mean they're relevant, and doesn't mean they'll correlate with anything else. And I'd say of the SIEM systems we look at that people don't like, it has nothing to do with the SIEM. It does everything the vendor said it could. It's just that what it's being fed is garbage. So then you have a garbage in, garbage out issue. Or you have an opinion that says the SIEM can take firewall logs, firewalls have these great logs, but it turns out your firewall doesn't actually make great logs. So in that case, it's not that the SIEM is failing, it's that the systems you have either aren't configured properly or are incapable of creating the data that a good SIEM system would be able to take advantage of. And the last one I'll point out is that solution confusion. Do people want log archives, AI-driven analytics of your logs, or something more along the line of NetFlow and IPFix validations, which is where I would basically claim that that's threat management at that point versus a SIEM system. One thing we'd like to point out, two SIEM systems that don't really do SIEM. So these two vendors are pretty much in magazines. I'm talking about AlertLogic and Event Tracker. They're in there as SIEM platforms. Their technology, though, doesn't really care about your logs. I can actually implement it. I can ignore all of your logs, and 90% of the alerts that come out of it that you find useful will still work because they've already adopted the fact that they need to do threat management in a seamless way or in a log-free way. However, everyone from a marketing point of view keeps hearing the word SIEMs. They're like, I need a SIEM system. That's what the business wants me to buy. And so they've kept adopting that language, but in reality, they're doing threat hunting. They're doing threat management, and they're doing it predominantly without the logs. And for us, that's great because that's what we wanted people to get it anyway. And then sometimes people say, well, why is this one better? And my answer to that's pretty simple. When people say, I don't want a noise generator, I don't want a lot of false positives, and I want something that will actually alert me when something useful happens, all of those alerts, in our experience, always comes from the threat management component of any of these systems, not really the log management component of any of these systems. And SIEM at heart is really log management from the beginning. So for us, SIEM is really a buzzword, and we care more about what do you want to do with it, what do you want the outputs to be, what do you want that goal state to be. So here's a nice corruption of Bill's diagram that I stole from him. One of the things that I like to point out here is what are you trying to do, where is it, and why are you trying to do it? Most people, they have a SIEM. The SIEM is in their data center. The SIEM's working well in the data center, but they tell me they're worried about their SaaS apps, AWS, Azure, people hitting 365, all kinds of stuff like that. And I say, great, where does it integrate to your SIEM? And the answer is it doesn't. So we got to look at that and say, well, if this is your primary concern, what should you be doing? I can tell you that from our aspect, if we want these things to work well, if we want them to feed a SIEM and be good at it, there's three precursors that really need to happen. One, authoritative single sign-on. Two is something like cloud app security. Cloud app security is not just from the aspect of securing the applications, but it is also a way to make sure all of those disparate cloud applications can create logs your SIEM can do something with and have some kind of togetherness or relevancy across the different systems. So for example, if I've got the cloud app security and I'm looking at Salesforce and I'm looking at Microsoft, being able to do things like the traditional Microsoft Impossible Travel, but across third-party systems. Because nowadays, no one is just one third party anymore. It's not just Salesforce. It's not just 365. It's a big combination. And so you want to be able to apply that type of security and say, what I'm really worried about is someone in California using my Salesforce account and someone in Europe using my Microsoft account, and I'm sitting here at home because of the coronavirus, and I'm actually in West Virginia, right? And most normal systems right now, they're not going to handle that unless you have something in that cloud app security vein that's actually paying attention to those logs and then can feed your SIEM the appropriate information. And the last piece here that I'll say for that is integrated security platform. That's really important. Bill stole some of it earlier in the presentation when he started talking about timestamps, right? Because a lot of systems don't generate great logs. And I know you can probably ask your system administrators, how many logs properly say, I'm UTC, I'm Green Mountain Time, I'm Pacific? They don't. And half the time, the times are wrong anyway. And in a SIEM system, if you don't have an integrated security platform, that's the only key they have to tie things together. Timestamp. It's the only thing that the machine learning can say this is relevant because it happens on this system at this time, this system at this time, and that's the universal correlator between the two. When we have an integrated security platform, we have global unique identifiers. So what does that mean? It means that there's a new key that knows that timestamps are wrong, but can work in disparate systems so that the system itself will have good data, the socket analytics will have good data, or if you want to feed it to a SIEM, you've got consistent data going across. And that's what we find from a triage standpoint is having the ability to link from system to system to system and have the data be relevant as you migrate your systems is how we are able to catch the bad guys and figure out how to stop things sooner, better, faster, easier. And then we'll also say, is SIEM the right investment? So I was working with Scott and Tim, and we probably had, I don't know, Scott, like 7 SIEM-related calls in the last 3 weeks, 4 weeks. What's really funny is these are the top 3 things people say they want. I want to fight when people take over accounts. I want to secure activities across multiple clouds. And I want to discover when people are doing things they're allowed to do, but in a bad way. So basically, a hijacked account or someone internally, let's say someone clicked a button inside, I think that came up. So someone clicked a button inside their account, their system started doing weird things. Was it taken over? No, it's still all inside on the PC, but they're doing things that user is allowed to do, but in a manner that any good behavioral analytics system should freak out and say, well, that's bad. So what's interesting to me here is these are the 3 things people ask us for, but the conversation always starts with log management or a SIEM system. Our point of view here is that a SIEM system is probably not the right investment if this is what you're actually worried about. One of the reasons is all of these systems create gigs and gigs and gigs of logs. And if you want these 3 things, you need to get it on every single system you have and every cloud system you have. The massive amount of logs that would be, and then if you're actually paying for a SIEM system that is doing good analytics, astronomically expensive. I could almost implement every security tool that me and Behzad could imagine for the price of what it would take for some of those monthly service fees from a true SIEM analytics company. And then at the end of the day, all the SIEM system will really tell us is, yeah, something bad did happen. Right? It didn't block it, didn't stop it, didn't do anything, but you're right, something bad did happen. And at times that's great, right? Because they say attacks nowadays, I think the last one I saw was about 308 days that an average attack is in an environment before someone notices, right? So the whole goal to a SIEM system is to get that number down. But it's to get that number down, not to prevent it in the first place. When people say these are the 3 things I'm worried about, it should be more about preventing these things in the first place, not just shortening the window of when you're notified of it or when you're able to notice it. And so when we look at these 3 things, we say, okay, well, what should someone have done if they're worried about this? And what's interesting is almost all 3 of these are some combination of the same few things. Multi-factor authentication, SSO, cloud app security or a CASB-like system, integrated security access control, as well as API-driven cloud app security. So I'm going to add that last one here and relate that to the coronavirus. You take everybody and you have them go home, okay? I think, Mark, I'm going to pick on you. You said split tunneling and whether you should do it or not. And so one thing to keep in mind, if you went to a cloud application, right? If you went to 365, that takes a lot of bandwidth. And if you take everybody and say, go home to your fast internet, everybody come back to my internet, and then we're going to loop you through again. So basically everything has to traverse at least twice, if not 3 times in that pattern. It's never going to happen, and those applications aren't going to work. And you're going to have people saying, if they have someone like Bill, who's making 60 meg PowerPoints, right, that everyone's going to try to open, if that's a small one. But when you think about that, if you're going to have something like that and then have it go through not split tunneling on your firewall, it'll never happen in reality. You'll never get enough bandwidth for that. Or it will work, but your users will be so ticked off, then it becomes IT won't let me work from home because it just doesn't work right. Okay, and that's not really what we want to get, and it's not really useful. And so what we have to worry about in that is assume we can't make them VPN in. We can't do full tunneling because it's just not practical. People can't afford to have the 10, 20 gigs of internet that you would need just for that purpose. And so what we have to kind of give up is this next piece here, which is the old thinking versus the new thinking. So on the old thinking, everything was behind a firewall. You controlled it all. You could have control, you could have logs, you could have SIEM, and those things could actually do something useful because you controlled every single bit of it. On the right side, we have the new thinking, which is you've got distributed access from devices, homes, the offices, and you're not really in control. You can't get logs from all of those systems. And the more advanced the cloud system is, the less they want to give you those logs. And so you have to adapt to it. So when I mentioned on the previous slide API-driven cloud app security, one of the things you're looking for there is that you really don't control if you're going to have everybody work from home from the coronavirus, or if you just have an executive team, right? They're going to have tablets. They're going to have phones. You're going to say, only use your work laptop. They're going to say, okay, and then call into the help desk saying that they're on their iPad at the airport and they want to play with the file for the board and go fix it. And so as these things expand, what API-driven security gives you is the fact that you're acknowledging you don't control the endpoints, but you want security anyway. Okay, so let's say, I saw somebody with an iPad here. Yeah, okay. And so with the iPad as an example, right, most people don't have antivirus on it. iPads are one of the fastest growing operating systems that get viruses, but nobody ever has antivirus running on it that we've run into. That's going to hook into your 365. Your 365 is going to be fully encrypted as the user hits it to go from 365 to that endpoint to every other endpoint they hook it up with. Right? So if it's OneDrive, you're replicating whatever bad malware they gave you in a fully encrypted tunnel, hiding it from all your firewalls and traditional security until it drops on every other endpoint that CEO has, right, inside your network. And then when they go and double-click it and run it, they're doing it completely inside your network from a quote-unquote safe source. Cloud App Security's goal is to sit there and say, okay, we don't want that to happen. We can't control all the endpoints. We give up. We can't afford to buy enough phones and iPads for everybody in every business. It just costs too much. But we still need to secure it. And so when we're doing it at the API level, what that means is if Aaron is on a home system, he's passed through his multi-factor authentication, he's in his OneDrive, or he's in his Teams site, or he's in just his email, but it's an unsecured iPad. What the Cloud App Security is going to do is say, okay, as soon as he tries to save that into his OneDrive, when it's working at the API level, it says, I don't need to be in front of it. I don't need to be a gateway like an old email spam system. I don't need to have an antivirus client. As soon as he starts interfacing with, whether it be Salesforce, Dropbox, Box, 365, as soon as that file's set, it's basically like doing old-fashioned server-side antivirus, even though you're fully in the cloud and you don't control any of it because it's controlled by Microsoft or whoever else. So that's what Cloud App Security is for, and that's why it's really relevant in terms of things like pandemics, because if you really have to blow out who can get to what and where they can be is kind of anywhere, what we find is most people want Office. They want email. They want to open their documents. They want to pass spreadsheets with people. That's pretty common. And nowadays, to say, let's balloon our VDI deployment to cover our entire workforce, it's not so practical anymore. It costs a lot. There's a lot of bandwidth involved. So what we like to say there is that uncontrolled people, devices, and disparate applications are why CAS starts becoming more important than doing a SIEM system. And so to relate this back to what's the correct investment, well, what are you worried about? Are you worried about things like this? Because a SIEM really isn't going to help you. If you are, you should be looking at CAS. And one of the things that we like to tell people is if you put the right building blocks in place, then by the time you're ready for a SIEM again, it'll actually do something useful, right? You want to make sure that that SIEM looks at the fewest number of really high quality logs to give you good data. You don't want a SIEM to sit there and hash through hundreds of tons of very low quality logs, because then your signal and noise ratio is just going to be out of whack. So to pick on Cloud App Security, another piece here that I kind of jumped off of, which is as everyone works from home, think about how that sharing is going to go up, right? Think about who the people in your organization deal with and the fact that they're working from home, and more people are going to say, let me share this file, let me share this folder, what am I going to do with it? And then you don't control any of those endpoints. I've got a lot of clients that sit there and they say, okay, well, we shared out our Teams site to our clients so that they could just drop the files to us, right? It's a very convenient method for that, or the SharePoint Online site. That's another big risk situation, right? You got a nice SSL tunnel from that unknown person dumping straight into your document libraries, and then all of your staff viewing it as a completely safe area, because it's the area IT gave them. It's supposed to be safe. So that's another piece where cloud app security, in this situation we're talking about, becomes much more useful than, let's say, a traditional SIEM. But again, all depends on what your goals are and what you want to get out of it. I can tell you that a lot of people are worried about ACH wire transfer fraud. And let's face it, you're about to tell people to go work from home. So the ability to run down the hall and say, did you send me this, pretty much just disappeared, right? Almost all ACH wire transfer fraud that we deal with it a lot, and I got to tell you, it hurts the nonprofits and small businesses more than anybody wants to talk about. It's all the little guys that are getting hit. And it always starts with an account that was taken over. Not a clandestine malware or hack or anything like that. It's people forgot their passwords or lost their passwords, and someone tapped into that email account. And so that account has been taken over, and that's pretty much how all of those start. They also start with phishing attacks. What we've seen is most people are really catching on to the bad phishing attacks. So when we find out that it's been successful and someone has mispaid someone or basically fallen victim to it, when we track it back, it's almost always from a legitimate account takeover issue. And your SIEM isn't going to help with that. But your risk of that damaging your company is now through the roof, and working from home is going to make that worse. All right, so talking about cloud app security, I'm going to skip over these because I kind of said them a little bit. But really the big things you want are extra phishing protection, extra account takeover protection, and zero-day and malware protection. But not just from an email perspective. You want it for Teams. You want it for Salesforce. You want it for Jira. You want it for all of those cloud apps where you're sharing data internally, externally, with your customers, with your members, what have you. Cloud app security can do that. And so why that's relevant is, as we were talking about, let's go distribute our workforce, let them get things done. I think someone had said California and New York branches were already closed, right? They got to be working somewhere, somehow. This is where that becomes really, really important. And there's two sides of that coin, account takeover, as well as just pure security itself. Okay. One of the things that we want to make sure of is that, in this case, we're talking about the SonicWall Cloud App Security. This is where we get into that unified framework, right? Because if I can have Box, if I can have Dropbox, if I can have all of OneDrive, Teams, SharePoint, if I can have Salesforce, and a bunch of other apps all feed the same style of CASB, well, then it means if I want to use a SIEM, I at least have consolidated logging. But if I don't necessarily care about the SIEM, I care about security, I can actually reach out and touch all of those disparate systems. That is something right now any spam system can't do. And so while sometimes people look at the CAS and are like, okay, kind of advanced anti-spam, spam's about email. Email's traditionally about gateways. And that has nothing to do with all of this file sharing and the true risk here, which is both the access and the data sharing built into all of these applications. The other piece I like here is being able to say we can now get into things like DLP, and we can get into things such as zero-day. So to touch on DLP real quick, who's got a system that if someone starts uploading files to Salesforce to share with their customers that's got data that they're not supposed to let out of the company, who's got a system that can see that right now? Now, what's the likelihood that the sales, marketing, and service people using Salesforce randomly put that stuff into the system probably on a daily basis? I can tell you from looking at it, it's really high, especially in any environment where they say we don't do that. As soon as they say that, we're like, okay, yeah, we're going to find it. Let us look. And so that's an important piece where that ability to start stretching DLP out, and again, in situations where you don't control the endpoint. I know some folks have endpoint DLP. You'll say, it's okay, my endpoint DLP will catch it. And that's great, unless people are running around on their iPads because it's a cloud system, and they can. And you don't have a DLP endpoint on your iPad, for example, or the phone. I don't know about you guys, but I got full Teams integration on my phone. I can see any file I want, just about. I got to go through like 4 levels of authentication and multi-factor and stuff to do it, but other people don't quite tighten it down that much, and you can get it down to a cell phone at this point. Salesforce, ADP, Workday, ServiceNow, all of those kind of things. You can get it down to almost any endpoint. And of course, the cloud vendor, they want you to do that, right? It makes their system more usable, more user-friendly. So, the real point here is getting that DLP. That's kind of a new thing that you can do, which, of course, when you're talking about distributed workforce, you want to have some of that capability. And then the second piece here I'll bring up for 0-day is, if you've been to some of the other events, we talk about next generation antivirus. We talk about doing advanced threat protection. One of the keys to that is sandboxing, right? You get a file, you get a link. Email systems do this a lot, right? They take away the link and they give you a different link to click, or they run the file through a sandbox before you can get it. And that's all well and good and interesting, but it's going through hops, right? And then at some point you're waiting 30 minutes, 90 minutes for that email to get through all of these hops. And then typically we hear the finance guys yelling at IT saying, I'm waiting for this file from the auditor. What's taking so long? Why isn't it here? So with that, we like to mention things such as the Cloud App Security. When it's API based, it's not a gateway, it's not a hop. That file is there, the file's been delivered, you can scan that file via the API, and you're not making something jump through multiple gates to get to your environment. What's good about that is, whereas email's been doing it for a while, it doesn't do OneDrive, doesn't do SharePoint, doesn't do Teams, Box, all that kind of good stuff. And people are sharing lots of files there. And if you're sharing files from an external source or a member or a client or a customer, they're not necessarily jumping through any gateway that you have. So in this case, the same ATP sandboxing that we talked about for other systems actually works in this CAS model as well. And so what's good about that is you can reach into Salesforce, grab those files, and actually run them through a sandbox to make sure no one is delivering you an infected file, as an example. And sometimes the point of view is, okay, well, I've got antivirus or EDR on my endpoint, so if they do infect that and then I open it, I'm good. But everyone seems to always forget that whoever has access to that on this laptop can get it on their PC. Maybe they're at home, maybe they're on an iPad. I think almost every time we've ever gone in and said, show me the exception list to your security for your executives, the answer is pretty much all of the executives are on that list. And so in that regard, you still got to protect those people that you don't know. Another fun thing that we like to mention for people about this is we see a lot of agreements and purchase agreements that say, we want you to dump your purchase orders in our site and we'll process it. And by the way, if you give us a virus, you're responsible for all costs. And a lot of people don't ever read that part of the contract because the purchasing department does. But occasionally we get to read some of that stuff. And I can almost guarantee you've signed, or someone at your company has signed something that says that, absolutely, either to customers or to your own vendors. And so something like this is a good way to protect yourself from one of your users making a mistake, clicking a button, getting infected, and then placing an infected file somewhere to get somebody else. Because that's what everybody wants to do, especially the insurance companies nowadays, right? Is they want to prove that they don't have to pay Aaron out because Aaron was infected by Tim, and so really Aaron needs to go chase Tim down, and the insurance company doesn't want to foot that bill, because that's really their goal, right? Not to pay out an insurance claim. So really this can help with that style of risk as well. So the key things we like to tell people is, where do we start? So for me, it's precursors. Do you have single sign-on? Do you have CAS that will actually block things? And then getting into some kind of integrated security platform. And the integrated security platform doesn't have to be a specific technology. I think you mentioned a SOC that you were working with. Sometimes a SOC or someone like Redzone or SonicWall, being able to merge those things together and give it to you as a merged solution is the integrated platform. And what you have to get to is, what do you want to get out of that platform so that you make sure everybody's happy with what that relationship's going to be. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a technology. It can be, the service firm itself that is providing that to you. And then in that regard, because one of the things we talked about is to mention why things fail. Anybody who says no problem, every technology, we got it covered, you know that that's going to fail, right? Because they use one of the absolute words of every, all, any. Can't happen. So definitely be on the lookout for that. And then if you've gotten through those three, the real question is, do you want threat management or SIEM? More and more, we're always going to be pushing on the threat management side because we've seen too many times people with SIEMs still get bit by malware, viruses, and hacking attempts. All right, so if it doesn't help with those, why do we have it? Unless an auditor makes us. If the auditor makes you, then you got to have it because the auditor makes you. You try to make it as cheap as possible and as effective as possible. But for the rest of us, the question is, where do we want to spend those funds? Can we take it out of this bucket and put it into a more proactive bucket? Or can we change what we're doing with it and how we're doing it to make it more useful? I can tell you one thing we've always noticed when people have SIEM and they've hooked it up to their 365 systems, and they're like, my SIEM collects my 365. I've only got, I think we've gone through, I was talking with my guys about 20 different ones we looked at. There were only 2 that actually had their 365 licensing correct so that the SIEM would get valid logs. So that's a really low percent. But of course, you go to the SIEM, it sees logs, right? It gets data. You can do a test and say, okay, can I see some information in here? So it kind of passes all the sniff tests. But then when you ask the question, is the log actually useful? That's where we find that people don't have the licensing. Because for example, if you want your SIEM to be effective for 365, if you don't have EMS E3 or you don't have Azure AD Premium 1, Microsoft actually does not put some of the security information in the logs. The logs still exist, but the data is not there because you haven't paid for it yet. It's in your dashboard, and you can visually see it. But if you're counting on that SIEM to alert you in the middle of the night that says something really bad just happened, the data's not there because you haven't paid Microsoft for it. And in that specific case, that's probably the most common error that we've found. And then that begs the question of, well, what's my SIEM for then? And how many other licenses do I need to buy? And how many other SaaS systems or cloud systems do I need to buy another license before my SIEM is useful? At which point you could have bought a CAS system that would have done it on the front side 3 times over.
Does EMS E3 include Cloud App Security?
EMS E3 includes Azure AD Premium 1. Cloud App Security is either an add-on or part of E5. Cloud App Security from the Microsoft point of view. So this is one of the cases where SonicWall actually used the name first, and then about a year later, Microsoft used the same name. It does not do 70% of everything I just said, even though it's got the same exact name. It can do some pretty cool stuff. It can do some very interesting things. However, if you want the Microsoft version of Cloud App Security to be very effective, you need to have EMS E5 or EMS E3 plus the Cloud App add-on and Windows E5. Nobody likes Windows E5 because it's really expensive. But you actually need all of the premium enhancements to Windows Defender. And by the way, you need to run Windows Defender if you want the Microsoft Cloud App Security to actually do all the cool stuff that it says it can do. And most people aren't ready for that license charge or to uproot basically everything. Because that also means you have to run Intune. And it also means you have to run SCCM, or the new name for SCCM. You got to buy into all of that. And so that becomes the time where it's like, okay, third party's cheaper. I can just get my normal Azure AD Premium or my EMS E3 and third party for much less cost and less integration. All right, and so kind of the last thing I'll leave it here is this is a graph we kind of showed people before, which is our take on these are useful security things that are proactive. And in the middle, we have, well, here's what a SIEM and a SOC can do, and where threat hunting plays. And our point to this graph is, if you don't have something in every single circle there, then you could have been blocking more. And what's the point in paying somebody to look at something that you could have just been blocking in the first place? And so if we're looking at a seam or we're trying to justify, a lot of times we do a lot of audit and compliance environments, right? DoD, PCI, HIPAA, we argue with auditors all day long. And so one of the things that they want to say is, well, before you tell me you're not going to put in the checkbox system that we tell you need according to the NIST 171 or what have you, tell me why. These circles are the answer. Is I need something in each of these circles to actually block things, and then I'll deal with what you want from a seam system or a SOC analysis. So our point of view for that is the look less, block more. You want to get it to the point where all noise, all trash, all easily identifiable garbage is stopped from entering or leaving your environment, so that that SIEM system or that threat management system is looking at the most useful information. And so what is really one of the highest cost services you'll probably have is getting the highest quality of information, because that's what they need to do their job, right? It's really hard to do threat analytics if you have to wade through just lots of noise, right? Simple math on that one.